Hello everyone, I'm Grim, a freelance artist, and let's talk about using 3D models for your art backgrounds in Clip Studio Paint. A lot of people know that you can do this, and likely if you read any webtoons, you've actually seen 3D models in use for backgrounds. However, doing it right and how exactly to use Clip Studio's 3D models is a bit of a mystery to a lot of people. So this video is going to go into how to do that and a few tips to ensure your backgrounds look good when you do this. I personally use 3D model backgrounds all the time in my webcomic to speed up my process. It cuts a lot of overwork out of my schedule, and outside of that, they can make great guides to help with your pieces. Keep in mind that the ability to convert images and 3D models into lines and shading is a feature of Clip Studio Paint EX, so you will need that version of CSP to follow along with this video. It's quite expensive, so I'd honestly only recommend buying it if you're seriously interested in using the webcomic and animation features that the program offers. If you don't need it, I wouldn't worry about it. With that out of the way, let's get into why you would use this feature and then how. When it comes to using 3D models in art, some people might be thinking, hey, wait, isn't this cheating? Which in some ways, some people might consider it that. But also, we made computers to help with our other processes. A computer, though, can't fully replicate hand-done line work like the gorgeous stuff you see in mangas like Hellsing or Giovanni Piranesi's drawings. But if you're not doing line work like that, or can't afford to for every step of your process, having the computer do part of it for you is a huge boon. We made digital art programs to help us draw digitally with tools that only a computer can do. And that is what this is. That being said, you also still need to make creative decisions like composing your models in an appealing way, using the camera settings to its fullest, and lots of other decisions that honestly overlap with filmmaking. So if you want to get really good at using 3D models in your art to help with your 2D work, I would genuinely suggest you learn about filmmaking techniques and composing shots. But that's a thing for another video. I can kind of talk about it, but it's not super my specialty. It's a thing I know on the side. Anyway, another thing I feel is important to note as to why you shouldn't really feel bad about using 3D models to aid with things like backgrounds and laying out your perspective for a scene is because it's a very standard thing to do in concept art and animation. 3D blockouts allow concept artists to paint over the geometry that a level designer has created. They provide reference for films in animatics, and plenty more. I personally think that if the people who would traditionally be called quote-unquote industry professionals are doing it, it's probably fine for freelancers or hobbyists to use the same tools, with a huge asterisk that as long as it does not remove or hinder your ability to make creative decisions as the artist. I'm looking directly at AI, which does that, so it's not a valid tool to me. I also think it's worth noting that using 3D models for your backgrounds is not a replacement for learning perspective, composition, and more. If you don't learn those fundamentals, you just won't be able to use these tools effectively. They're not a shortcut, they are a supplement to speed up your process. And lastly, I know there are probably people saying, but you could do this in Blender. And that is absolutely true. You can. If that's more your bag, go for it. Blender is a lot more powerful than Clip Studio Paint when it comes to 3D tools. That being said, not everyone wants to learn Blender, and some people just don't need the extra tools at the moment, which is where I am. I'm plenty happy to use Clip Studio's basic stuff and just work with it. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's get into how to use the line extraction tools in Clip Studio Paint. This is not going to be a tutorial on how to click buttons. I trust you know how to do that. But if you're wondering how to actually get to the tools in the first place, I'll do a really quick run through of what the overall process looks like. So, while using the object tool and having your 3D layer selected, head over to the layer property panel. If that's not visible, go to window and check the layer property button to ensure that you can see it. The second button in that panel has two overlapping circles. That is the extract line layer effect. Click on it. This works well enough, but it won't give you all the tools we need. You'll want to click the convert layer to lines and tones button. This will bring you to the real meat and potatoes of this feature. This menu has lots of settings for you to play with. It's a little different between CSP versions, so I recommend you play with those settings until you get a result you like, making sure to check the preview button to see how it looks. When you're happy with your preview, click OK, and let CSP do its thing. Once it's done working, you will get a folder with the results. Inside that folder is lots of useful stuff like tones, fill, and lines, which you'll be able to use for your own purposes. In the case of using 3D models for backgrounds, you'll be able to work inside of this folder to edit it, change your shadow colors, all sorts of other things that you can do as if it were a normal vector and raster layer, which is awesome. With that little how to use this tool out of the way, let's get into some tips for more advanced things you can do with it. So, tip number 1, the bigger your canvas, the better line tracing quality you'll get. Because the line tracing is done using math to create vector lines, the more pixels you give the computer to work with, the more accurate of a tracing you'll get. It'll just have places to put those lines. This, of course, will require a more demanding PC to do, but if you're running into issues with the accuracy of your line tracing, try copying your 3D models into a new canvas, upscaling the image resolution in the edit menu, and then running your line extraction. This is particularly handy for webtoons, which demand specific smaller file sizes, and once that's done, you can copy-paste your result into your main canvas and scale it down, and it'll look great. Now, tip number 2 is a caveat I alluded to in tip number 1. This feature is very heavy on your PC. Be kind to it. You need a decently chunky PC to run line extraction, so expect it to chug, especially if you are using lots of models, you have big files for print, or if your models are particularly heavy and have a lot of geometry. The only other tip I can really give you for this is to not leave other software open at the same time if you can. Try to minimize the amount of other stuff your computer has to do if you're doing line extraction and your PC is struggling. Tip number 3, try out the fog feature with your 3D models to achieve depth. If you want to recreate atmospheric perspective with your 3D models, definitely try checking the little box in your 3D models controls in the layer properties to use the fog feature. You can even change its color, which can help for nighttime scenes where you want the background to fade into darkness. Tip number 4, if you want a guide for shadows, turn those on in your light source before tracing lines. Newer versions of CSP have the ability to cast shadows across models and everything, so if you're wanting that for reference, make sure you turn those on. They can help give you a head start on shading your piece by serving as a basic block end. And for backgrounds, if all the geometry and tracing is accurate, it can just be your shading for the background. I personally do this by just grabbing the clipping mask and applying the mask to my shading layer. And tip number 5, if your models have flat colors, you can use those to get a start for your base colors. To make coloring easier, I suggest turning off outlines and lighting on these models, duplicating the layer, and rasterizing it. That way, you can work with your colors like they were a normal color layer. And that's all the tips I have for you about using 3D models for your webcomic backgrounds. I hope this guide gave you a good rundown on how and why to use this feature, and if you have any questions, feel free to ask down below in the comments. I will do my best to answer. I didn't get into too much technical detail since I think this is a feature that's just easier to learn by playing with it. So that's what I'd encourage you to do. In the meantime, this is the part of the video where I ask you to like and subscribe, as that is what tells YouTube this was useful and helpful. And if you're looking for a cozy, nerdy, and queer little community, swing by the description for an invite to my Discord server. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Bye-bye!